The morning air was thick with dust and the smell of wild sage as Carolyn Whitmore stood at the edge of her white fenced property line, gripping a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. She squinted across the road at the sprawling ranch that had recently changed hands, her lips tightening into a line of suspicion. The old Granger Ranch had stood empty for over 2 years after the previous owner passed away, but now it was alive, again with workers, animals, and what Carolyn saw as chaos. To most people, the new owner, Grant Hawkins, was a quiet, reserved man in his mid-40s who had bought the land cash and moved in with no family, no pets, and no explanations. But to Caroline, president of the Chestnut Ridge Homeowners Association, Grant was a red flag in denim. The Chestnut Ridge HOA governed a unique rural suburban hybrid of properties just outside Riverbend County, where old ranches met newly developed mini-estates, and Caroline had taken it upon herself to ensure the right kind of people moved in. She'd seen the man exactly twice since he arrived, once at the post office and once as he unloaded lumber into his barn at dusk, and both times he gave nothing more than a polite nod before disappearing like smoke. It wasn't enough for Caroline. Something about him felt ... off. No social media presence, no known relatives, no visible signs of a past, and no real reason a man like that would settle in a HOA-restricted community unless he had something to hide. She began documenting every movement on his property, from the delivery trucks that pulled in at odd hours to the construction sounds that echoed through the trees at night. And she wasn't the only one. A few other board members, mostly neighbors, she'd brought in under her influence, began whispering their own concerns. One claimed he'd seen surveillance cameras being installed on fence posts. Another noticed license plates on the contractor trucks that didn't match local registrations. Caroline, with her flair for self-importance, decided it was her duty to act. On a Friday morning, she marched down Grant's gravel driveway in a khaki skirt and HOA windbreaker, a clipboard in hand, ready to issue a formal citation for unauthorized outbuildings. But Grant wasn't home, or so she thought. As she peered into the side barn, she heard a sharp metallic clink from behind and turned to see him, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black shirt rolled at the sleeves and holding a pair of wire cutters. His expression was unreadable, not angry or friendly, but something still and assessing, like he was weighing her entire existence. "Can I help you?" he asked. Caroline stumbled into her role. She introduced herself, explained the community, regulations about property structures, noise levels, and visible equipment. But Grant simply stared at her, his head tilted slightly. "I read the bylaws," he said quietly, "and I'm not violating any of them. If I am, I'll need to see the specific clause." That irritated her more than she expected. She was used to being feared or at least respected, and this man gave her neither. She left that day with no win, but she wrote up a violation notice anyway and mailed it the next morning. The letter came back and opened, stamped, "Return to sender." That's when things started to escalate. Over the following weeks, Caroline's campaign against Grant grew more aggressive. She began calling county inspectors, reporting vague safety concerns. She logged noise complaints at odd hours, even though no one else heard them. She urged her fellow HOA board members to consider whether Grant's presence was lowering property values. But Grant, for his part, remained silent and out of reach. He attended no meetings, returned no calls, and somehow, none of the officials Caroline sent ever got past his locked gate. The final straw came when she saw him digging behind his barn late one night, illuminated by floodlights, shoveling what appeared to be thick, wet dirt into a large trench. It was enough. Caroline picked up the phone and called 911. Her voice quivered with forced fear as she told the dispatcher she was worried her neighbor might be burying something or someone. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, only to find Grant sitting calmly on his porch drinking coffee, a dog-eared paperback open in his lap. They questioned him briefly, walked around the property, and left with a smile and a wave. The next morning, a deputy returned and privately informed Carolyn that Grant Hawkins had been cleared and advised her to stop filing baseless complaints. That should have been the end of it. But Carolyn didn't believe in coincidences. She believed in conspiracies, and now, she was certain of one thing: Grant wasn't just a private man. He was something else. That same day, she drove an hour into the city and met with a private investigator, an old friend of her late husband's, who still owed her a favor. She handed him a photo of Grant, taken from across the road, and asked for a deep background check. It would take a few days, he said. While she waited, she doubled down. She had cameras installed at the edge of her property pointing toward his barn. She flew a hobby drone over the ranch and tried to peek through the upper windows of his farmhouse. She even called the fire department to perform a routine inspection on waterline accessibility for her zone, knowing full well it would bring them down Grant's private road. None of it worked. Every time someone approached the property, they turned around quickly. Their attitudes changed. It was as if Grant had already spoken to them and given them something they couldn't argue with. It enraged her, but her answer came faster than expected. On Tuesday afternoon, the PI called her back. "You were right," he said. "He's not who he says he is." Caroline gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles went white. "What do you mean?" she whispered. The investigator hesitated. "I couldn't find a birth record. social security, registration, or even a driver's license issued in that name. What I did find were sealed federal records linked to that alias. I have a contact in DC who ran the face scan through a defense database off the books, of course. Caroline, your neighbor is a federal agent. The words hit her like ice water. She asked for more, but he said he couldn't say anything else over the phone. You didn't hear it from me, he warned. You go poking around anymore, they might not just wave you off next time. But Caroline didn't scare easily. If anything, it made her more determined. Why would a federal agent, FBI, move into a quiet HOA ranching community with no declared mission, no warning, and no interaction with local law enforcement? The answer was obvious to her. He was hiding something. Either he was rogue, in witness protection, or running surveillance on someone, maybe even on her. Maybe her name had landed on some list. Caroline began gathering documents, HOA records, copies of her complaints, maps of Grant's property, printouts of encrypted equipment being delivered, every little suspicious detail she could find. She built a binder that would make any conspiracy theorist proud, filled with color-coded tabs, and printed Google Earth screenshots. She didn't know what her next move was, but she knew this. She wouldn't stop until she knew the truth. Across the street, Grant watched from behind his tinted office window, sipping coffee, a quiet smile flickering across his face. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen her type before, neighborhood tyrants with a savior complex and too much time. What she didn't know was that her name was already in a file, and the operation she thought she was unraveling had barely even begun. Caroline barely slept for the next 3 nights, pacing her home like a general plotting a silent war, her dining table covered in binders, satellite images, printouts, and color-coded sticky notes that framed her obsession like crime scene evidence. Every angle of Grant Hawkins' ranch had been scrutinized through binoculars, drones, and publicly available mapping data. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. Something solid, something undeniable that would not only expose him to the board but force local authorities to act. She convinced herself she wasn't doing this out of personal pride. This was about safety. What if he was hiding fugitives? What if his operation put the entire neighborhood at risk? She rehearsed these ideas so often that they became her truth. On Friday morning, wearing a white blouse and beige slacks that gave her a kind of civilian look, she walked into the Riverbend County Records office, requesting zoning maps and archived permits for the Granger Ranch's last 30 years. She claimed she was preparing a historic file for HOA compliance auditing. The clerk raised an eyebrow but handed her a stack of old records. What she found inside was nothing illegal, just a single line that stopped her breath. Temporary. Federal use permit classified, expired July 2015, authorization.dhws. It was vague, but it was enough. She took a photo, emailed it to herself, and added it to her growing file under a red tab labeled Evidence Federal Cover. That night, a new vehicle arrived at Grant's ranch, a matte black truck with government plates and tinted windows. 2 men got out, both in plain clothes but walking like they carried weapons. Caroline watched from her darkened upstairs window, phone recording every frame, heart pounding with both fear and victory. She had proof now, real movement, real connections. She sent the video to a private investigator with the subject line, "They're moving something." But the reply she received 20 minutes later wasn't reassuring. It was a single sentence: "Delete this footage now and stop contacting me." That shook her. She wasn't used to being told to back off. She wasn't used to being ignored. But instead of being afraid, she grew more aggressive. She drafted a report that very night, 38 pages long, complete with printed maps and timestamps outlining what she referred to as a potential domestic infiltration zone operating under false HOA compliance. Her plan was to bring the full binder to the next HOA meeting and present it to the entire board. But the meeting never happened. The following morning, a notice arrived at her door, a formal cease and desist from the county sheriff's department, warning her against further surveillance or interference with the Hawkins property, citing harassment and possible legal consequences. Caroline was livid. She stormed down to the sheriff's office demanding answers, but the receptionist wouldn't let her past the lobby. The deputy she spoke with wouldn't even confirm who filed the report. "Just move on, ma'am," he said. The man's well within his rights. Back home, she found her drone missing and 2 of her driveway cameras offline. That's when she snapped. She knew what was happening now. He wasn't just some federal officer on a mission. He had access, pool protection, and maybe a target. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she told the dispatcher there had been suspicious activity on the ranch, that she feared weapons were being moved, that she believed her own property had been tampered with. The operator listened patiently, promised to dispatch someone, and 30 minutes later a single unmarked cruiser rolled slowly past Grant's gate before turning around and leaving without stopping. The report went nowhere. She knew the signs. She'd been stonewalled. They were building a wall around him, cutting her out. She sat alone on her porch that night, binder in her lap, watching the dim glow of Grant's barn security lights in the distance. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through her own tabs again, rereading her notes like gospel. She had to go further. That Sunday morning, she knocked on the door of someone she'd avoided for years, Rex Tallman, a former Army engineer turned rancher who lived 5 miles north of Chestnut Ridge. Rex had no patience for HOA rules, never joined, and never paid dues. He also kept a shooting range on his property and was known for his off-grid paranoia. To Carolyn, he was crude and uncultured, but now he was exactly what she needed. She showed him the binder, fed him a story about a hidden operation moving into the county, and let his imagination do the rest. Rex grunted, flipped through the photos, and finally muttered, "Yeah, this smells like black budget feds." That was enough for Caroline. She began slowly gathering others, not just board members, but landowners outside the HOA, people who had long resented the HOA's reach but feared government involvement even more. She spoke their language: property rights, illegal surveillance, government overreach, rural freedom. Over the course of 2 weeks, she formed an informal protection watch, a kind of citizen-led group aimed at monitoring suspicious operations inside their rural boundary. They weren't armed yet, but they would be if necessary. Grant, meanwhile, was quietly aware of everything. His cameras picked up Caroline's late-night drives and Rex's arrival. His motion detectors logged every time a vehicle slowed near his gate, but he did nothing. No countermove, no escalation, just silence. Until one night, one of Caroline's group members, a hot-headed 25-year-old named Casey, who worked part-time at the feed store, decided to sneak onto Grant's property and plant a hidden trail cam in the trees near the barn. He wasn't to post it. Caroline had told everyone they needed proof, not trespassing, but Casey was drunk and eager, and sometime after 2 a.m. he crossed the fence line and disappeared into the brush. 30 minutes later, he stumbled back into the road screaming. His left shoulder had been dislocated, he had bruises up and down his ribs, and his shirt was shredded. He claimed he'd been tackled by a silent black shape that came out of nowhere, pinned him, then let him go without a word. He didn't see a face, didn't see a weapon, but he was certain it was him. Caroline took one look at him and called 911. Again, this time she didn't report it as suspicion. She reported it as an assault. Deputies came, but Casey refused to press charges. He wouldn't even give a statement. Whatever scared him out there had rattled him too badly. The next day, Rex showed up at Caroline's house with 2 of his friends. "We're not waiting anymore," he said. "If the sheriff won't do it, we will." Caroline begged for caution, pleaded for them to wait, to let her gather more evidence. But the fire had already spread. The next night, they came back with 4 trucks, 2 trail cams, and 3 scoped rifles. Their plan was simple: get footage, expose Grant, and if he confronted them, stand their ground. What they didn't know was that Grant was waiting, not with weapons, but with recording equipment and backup. At 3:12 a.m., as the trucks lined up along the tree line facing his barn, a flare lit up the sky. Drones buzzed from the shadows, floodlights activated, and a deep, calm voice echoed through a speaker hidden in the trees. "You are trespassing on federal property. Leave now. You are being recorded." The men panicked. 2 tried to reverse. 1 truck got stuck in the mud. Rex fired a warning shot into the trees, and instantly the sound of a bolt-action rifle clicked somewhere above them. They all froze. No one moved. No one saw where it came from. Then the voice again. "Second warning. You are under live surveillance. Leave now." Caroline, who had been monitoring her shortwave radio at home, heard the panicked CB chatter from Rex's truck and felt her stomach twist. She realized for the first time that things were no longer in her control. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore. This was something much bigger. She didn't sleep that night, and by morning the town had changed. News traveled fast. People were scared. Rumors of secret operations, government standoffs, and private militias exploded across the county. The sheriff issued a statement urging residents not to trespass or interfere with law enforcement activity in restricted zones. Grant's property was now labeled federally monitored. Caroline sat in her kitchen staring at the binder. She had started this to protect her neighborhood. But now, there were guns, drones, radio threats, and men who were willing to die for their own truth. She thought she was exposing a danger, but maybe she had become the danger. The days following the standoff on Grant Hawkins' property brought a thick unease over Chestnut Ridge and the neighboring ranch communities. The local paper ran a small article titled "Dispute on Private Land Escalates Tensions," but it was a sterilized account that didn't begin to capture the fear running through the area. Law enforcement gave no detailed statements, only vague reminders to respect private property and avoid unauthorized gatherings. But the damage was already done. Caroline Whitmore's once neatly organized HOA meetings had turned into whispered conversations and sideways glances. The board members who once eagerly followed her lead now hesitated to return her calls. Some of them had friends or spouses who'd heard about Rex Tallman's little militia scare, and now Caroline's name was being whispered in grocery aisles and hardware store parking lots, not as a protector of the neighborhood, but as the woman who nearly got people shot. Still, she couldn't stop. The obsession had moved beyond HOA protocol. It had become a mission. She spent her mornings pacing, checking her security cameras every 20 minutes, her afternoons rereading legal clauses that she once helped enforce, hoping to find some overlooked loophole that would justify a new push. But there was nothing. Grant Hawkins hadn't broken any law that anyone could prove. And worse yet, her own allies were slipping away. Rex had gone dark, no longer returning her messages. And rumor had it he had packed up and headed for his cousin's ranch upstate. Casey left town completely. Even the private investigator she'd hired months before had cut off all contact. When she tried calling again, the number was disconnected. Then something strange happened. A white unmarked envelope arrived at Caroline's mailbox with no stamp and no return address. Inside was a single piece of heavy paper folded once and printed. In the center was one short sentence. "You are not being ignored, you are being watched." Her hands trembled as she read it. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it wasn't a bluff either. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she sat for hours staring at the paper, realizing for the first time that whatever she had stepped into, it wasn't over. It was only getting deeper. Across the street, Grant continued his quiet routine. His truck left the ranch twice a week, always the same times, always the same routes. Workers came and went with high efficiency, order, no drama, no outbursts, and always an eerie level of calm. One day, Caroline sat in her car at the far edge of town, watching the only feed supply warehouse Grant ever visited. She waited 5 hours, just to see who he spoke with, how long he stayed, and whether anyone approached him. He arrived late, in the day, backed into a loading dock, and remained inside for 20 minutes. When he left, he carried nothing out, bought nothing, and drove off with the same expressionless face. She asked the clerk inside if the tall man in the black truck was a regular, and the man just stared at her a second too long before saying, "Never seen him." That's when Caroline began to suspect even deeper layers. What if the warehouse was a cover too? What if the entire town had people inside it? After all, if the government was embedded here, why stop at one ranch? She began taking photographs of people she didn't recognize. Delivery men, construction workers, utility crews. She kept a notebook of license plates that circled her street, more than once in a day. She even tried to track where the school buses stopped, noting when they lingered too long in front of Grant's road, even if there were no kids to pick up there. By now, Caroline's world had narrowed to a singular tunnel vision. Find the proof, stop the operation, reclaim her community. But the community had already made its decision. One by one, neighbors began requesting exemption from HOA obligations. Some started selling their homes quietly and moving out. Others held secretive block meetings without her. Even the board turned on her. At a special meeting she was not invited to, the HOA voted to remove her as president, citing erratic behavior, legal risk, and irreparable public relations damage. She found out the next morning when a pink slip and a lock change notice arrived in her mailbox, along with a request to hand over HOA documents by the end of the week. She didn't comply. She wouldn't. That binder of hers, now nearly 2 inches thick, was the only thing she had left, and it was more than notes, it was evidence. Or so she believed. She carried it like a shield, sometimes even sleeping with it under her pillow. But then came the fire. It was just after midnight when she woke to a crackling sound and the smell of smoke outside. A small blaze had erupted in the dry grass near her backyard, fence line 10 feet from the shed that held her surveillance drone equipment. She scrambled to grab her hose and call 911, panic overtaking her voice as she screamed her address. The fire didn't spread far, and firefighters arrived quickly, but it was enough to rattle her. The fire chief said it was likely caused by faulty electrical wiring in one of her shed's solar lights. But Caroline knew better. Someone was sending her a message. They didn't just want to scare her, they wanted to erase her evidence. That night, she moved all of her binders, drives, and documents to an off-site storage unit. She stopped sleeping in her bedroom and began keeping her lights off after dark. She carried pepper spray in one pocket and a concealed taser in the other. The fear was real now, not imagined, and she knew with chilling certainty that someone out there was watching her every move. Meanwhile, Grant received an encrypted package via secure drop and internal briefing marked exposure risk level, orange. Inside were surveillance photos not of him, but of Caroline, taken from multiple angles across multiple dates, proving she'd made contact with no actors and possibly handed over incomplete intel to civilians. Her binder, her obsession, had officially entered his world. His orders were not to intervene unless the exposure created a federal compromise. But the line was getting thinner every day. And worse, a name had appeared in the agency's surveillance logs, a man named Michael Vance, former intelligence contractor turned whistleblower, presumed off-grid, now possibly in communication with Caroline. That changed things. If she had unknowingly become the conduit for a rogue agent, then she wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore, she was a liability, a real one. Grant had a decision to make. He could flag her for red-level surveillance and let his team remove her quietly, or he could go to her, not as a threat, but as a warning. That same week, Caroline received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and familiar. You need to stop, he said. You're stepping into something bigger than you can understand. She froze. Who is this? She demanded, already knowing. You know who it is, he replied. Meet me at the old ranger station at dusk tomorrow. Bring nothing. Say nothing to anyone. If you want answers, that's your chance. Then the line went dead. She didn't sleep that night. She debated it 1,000 ways. It could be a trap, or it could be the only chance she had left to see the truth. By the time the sun set the next day, she was already parked at the ranger station, her car hidden in the trees, heart hammering against her ribs. And at exactly 7 p.m., Grant Hawkins appeared, walking out of the trees without sound, hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes watching her not with anger but with purpose. Caroline gripped her binder tightly against her chest as Grant Hawkins stepped into the clearing, the dying light of dusk filtering through the tall pine trees around the abandoned ranger station. For a man she had feared, studied, and accused, for months he didn't look dangerous, not in the way she expected. He looked calm, certain, and almost tired, like someone who had spent too long carrying the weight of things no one else could see. He stopped 10 feet in front of her and nodded once. You came, he said. You gave me no choice, she replied, her voice tense. You've been hiding, watching, manipulating this entire community. I want to know why. Grant didn't answer right away. He scanned the area behind her, checked the tree lines, then finally gestured toward the stone steps of the ranger station. Its doors weathered and padlocked, but the porch still intact. Sit down, he said. You wanted the truth. Fine, you get it. But after this, you stay out of it. Caroline hesitated but moved to the steps. Grant remained standing, watching the treetops like someone trained to expect sniper scopes. Then, in a voice as low and deliberate as a ticking bomb, he told her everything, or at least what he decided she needed to know. 3 years ago, the Department of Internal Threat Response, DIRT for short, flagged this county as a vulnerability point. Quiet rural region, overlapping jurisdictions, lots of law enforcement gaps between state, federal, and local. Good place for buried networks. Caroline frowned. What kind of networks? Domestic extremists, foreign-funded supply chains, compromised lawmen. It's a spider web, and it grows in places people ignore, like ranch towns. Grant continued, telling her he'd been placed here under deep cover, not just to observe, but to stop something. Something that hadn't happened yet, you think? I came here to watch you. You're a blip. I came here because someone else is watching this region from deeper inside it. And we know one thing for sure, they don't know who I am. Not yet. Caroline's throat tightened. Then why all the silence? Why not tell the sheriff? Why not involve the community? Grant laughed bitterly. Because the sheriff's office has leaks. So does the mayor's office. Your little HOA, they're clean, mostly, but useless when it comes to federal security. I needed a position with full autonomy, no interference. That's why I bought the Granger Ranch. It gives me range, distance, and legal protection. And the guns, the surveillance, the drones, Carolyn asked. Because the kind of people we're tracking aren't going to send letters of complaint. They're going to burn the whole county down if they get what they're after. And now, thanks to you, they might be moving early. He took a breath and stepped forward. Your name came across a flagged intel packet last week. You've made contact with someone we've been hunting for years, Michael Vance. Her face went pale. I don't know who that is. He contacted you through the pie, Grant said. That man didn't drop off the map because he was afraid of you. He dropped off because you were unknowingly bridging communication between Vance and this region. He used you. You became a blind node. And now we've got a ticking clock. Caroline's mouth opened, then closed. The binder she clutched against her chest felt suddenly heavier. So what happens now? She asked. Do you arrest me? Erase me? Grant shook his head. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to end this cleanly, but that means you need to walk away permanently. Forget the binder, forget the theories. Delete the files and go back to being a civilian. If you keep poking the bear, the wrong people are going to notice, and they won't. Ask questions first. Caroline's pride flared, but deep inside, fear crept in like cold water. So you're just asking me to forget everything, pretend none of this ever happened? Grant nodded once. Yes, for your own safety. He turned to leave. But she called after him. Something happens here. Something terrible, and I said nothing. Did nothing. How could I live with that? Grant paused, his back to her. You already did something more than you know. You flushed out the noise. You forced us to accelerate. That might save lives. Believe it or not. Then he vanished into the trees, and she was left alone with the wind in her thoughts. The next morning, she packed the binder in a fireproof case and drove it to a storage unit an hour out of town. She didn't destroy it, but she didn't open it again either. She kept the meeting to herself, didn't tell a soul. Something about Grant's voice, his conviction, had shaken her in a way she couldn't explain. For the first time in months, she didn't feel angry. She felt outmatched. But silence didn't last long in Chestnut Ridge. 1 week later, a massive brush fire broke out along the edge of the Western Ranch corridor, nowhere near Caroline or Grant's property, but close enough to raise alarms. It was ruled an accident by the fire marshal, likely started by sparks from illegal fireworks. But Carolyn noticed something no one else did. The burn line stopped just short of a group of radio towers owned by a private communications firm called Copper Valley Networks. The towers had no visible staff, no local phone listings, and no scheduled service visits for the last 2 years. Curious, she began digging, quietly. No drones, no cameras, just old-fashioned web research and property records. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. Copper Valley didn't own the towers, they leased them from a shell company out of Delaware. One linked to a defense contractor with a history of proxy signal routing. In other words, someone had been transmitting data through those towers under a false business name, and someone had nearly burned them down. She wanted to call Grant, to tell him, but she had no number, no contact, nothing, so she did the only thing she could. She returned to the ranger station at the same time the next night and waited. For 4 hours nothing happened, no one came. The trees were silent, the wind still. Finally she left. But the next morning a piece of paper had been slid under her garage door. It simply read, "We know, stay inside Friday night. Do not call 911. That Friday, as the sun dipped low, the county went quiet. No birds, no traffic. Not even the usual echo of livestock from neighboring ranches. Then, just after midnight, Caroline saw a convoy of black vehicles roll through the distant hills and marked, silent, headlights off. They moved with precision and purpose. At the same time, she saw flashes of light near the radio towers. No explosions, no flames, just brief, pulsing flashes, infrared maybe, or something more advanced. Within 2 hours the vehicles vanished again. The towers remained standing, and the next morning a local story broke. Lightning surge damages communications equipment. Service delays expected, but Caroline knew better. She'd witnessed a takedown, a quiet war, and it had passed right over their heads. For days afterward, she felt like a ghost in her own town. People smiled, waved, walked their dogs, attended HOA barbecues, but everything was hollow now. The world looked the same, but she had seen the strings. She no longer cared about lawn lengths or mailbox colors. She stopped filing complaints, stopped citing by. She handed over her key to the HOA storage room and declined further meetings. She was done pretending the rules mattered when the real game was played so far above their heads. One night, a strange comfort settled in. Not peace, she doubted, where she'd ever feel that again, but understanding. She saw Grant's truck rolling slowly along the ranch line, headlights casting soft yellow arcs through the trees. He never looked her way, but he didn't have to. She knew he'd seen her, and somewhere in the brief silence that followed, she nodded, not in surrender, but in recognition. The story wasn't over. Something larger still loomed, but her part was finished, or so she thought. The quiet didn't last. For nearly a month, Carolyn Whitmore tried to resume what little normalcy she could find in the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. But the truth she had unearthed had changed her too deeply to forget. She still walked her property at dawn, still sipped her black coffee while watching the mist rise off the hills of Chestnut Ridge, but the clipboard was gone. So were the rules, the violations, and the obsession with compliance. Her neighbors, once wary of her presence, now passed her in silence, some in guilt, others in suspicion, but Caroline no longer cared. She had stood too close to the fire and seen too much. But just when she thought she had accepted her role as a bystander to forces far beyond HOA politics, everything collapsed again. It began with the drone. Not hers, this one wasn't the hobby-grade surveillance toy she'd once used to peek into Grant Hawkins' property. This drone was large, black, fast, and didn't make a sound. She saw it first around 3 a.m., hovering silently near the treetops above the western edge of her backyard, lightless, motionless, as if watching. When she stepped outside to get a better look, it zipped off so quickly it left the leaves on her porch rustling. She stood in her slippers, heart racing, eyes wide, and for the first time in weeks, the old fear returned. The next day she drove straight to the county library, not to look up property records or signal towers, but to use their computer systems, which she believed might be safer than her own. She accessed a private channel her former PI had left for her, something buried on the darknet, once dismissed as paranoia, but now her only connection to the truth. There was a single message waiting, time-stamped 4 hours earlier. He's compromised. Extraction failed. Do not trust anyone claiming to be Hawkins. Her blood froze. The next evening she watched the ranch from a distance using her binoculars, the same pair she once used to count porch violations and grass height. At first, everything looked normal. The barn lights were on. The house windows glowed a soft yellow. But something felt off. The vehicle in the driveway wasn't his truck. It was a similar model, same color, but a slightly newer plate. A subtle change only someone obsessed would catch. The next day she confirmed it. The real Grant Hawkins license was no longer registered in any active government database. It had been archived, classified, deleted that night. A massive electrical blackout swept across Chestnut Ridge and the surrounding rural grid. Official word blamed a substation fire in the northern sector, but Caroline knew better. She stood on her back porch, lantern in hand, watching the horizon burn orange behind the hills. No flames reached the town, no evacuations were ordered, but communications were severed. Cell towers dropped, internet down. The town had gone dark in more ways than one. And then came the visit. 2 men in plain black jackets knocked on her door at 2:47 a.m. One held a small black folder. The other said nothing. "Ma'am, we're with the Department of Critical Infrastructure. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your recent contact with Mr. Hawkins." Her skin crawled. These weren't local agents. These weren't even federal in the traditional sense. There was something wrong with their eyes, vacant, cold, calculated, like they'd rehearsed the encounter 1,000 times. Caroline stepped aside, but only barely. "He doesn't live here. I have nothing to do with him anymore." The taller man nodded slowly. "We're aware this is strictly procedural. May we come in?" She hesitated. Everything in her gut screamed no, but something deeper inside her, some quiet instinct sharpened by paranoia, took over. "Wait here," she said, and closed the door. But she didn't go to the kitchen. She ran through the hallway to the rear exit, grabbed her emergency go bag, and slipped out into the trees behind her property. She heard them break the front lock exactly 30 seconds later. They weren't here to ask questions. She didn't stop running until she reached the abandoned ranger station where she had last spoken to Grant, but he wasn't there. Only a small, red flashlight taped to the underside of the porch with a note wrapped around it. In sharp, block letters it read, "Backup plan initiated. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, so should you be." She didn't cry. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply turned and walked into the woods. 2 miles west, she reached a gravel road where a single black motorcycle had been hidden under a camouflage top. It wasn't hers, but it had her name on the keychain for days. She vanished. She lived out of motels along the state line, changing locations every night, paying in cash, but even there, the shadow followed. Twice she saw the same unmarked SUV parked at gas stations. Once, she returned to her room to find her toothbrush moved 2 inches from where she left it. On the 7th day, she received a flash drive slipped under her motel door in a blank envelope. Inside were 4 files. One was an audio recording of Grant's voice, his real voice, not filtered, not disguised, saying, "If you're hearing this, then I failed. That means they breached the tower." Another file was a video. Grainy surveillance footage of Grant running through a forest at night, bleeding, pursued by unknown figures in black. The third file was a PDF labeled Asset Report, CW1707, with her full name and picture on the cover. The final file simply said "Run." That was the last straw. Caroline took the motorcycle, dumped it in a river, and used a stranger's phone to call a contact she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Former federal agent she met briefly during her husband's career. She used a passphrase she hoped still held weight. "Bluebird sings at dawn." There was a long pause. Then a female voice said, "How bad is it?" Caroline answered with a shaky whisper. They erased him. What followed was a rapid extraction she didn't fully understand. Within 3 hours, a black van pulled up to a designated truck stop. She was blindfolded, fingerprinted, and driven for hours. When the blindfold came off, she was inside a secure compound built into the side of a rocky hill somewhere in the Midwest. There, she was debriefed, not interrogated, and what she learned was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Grant Hawkins had indeed been an undercover federal operative, but not alone. He was part of a deep cell surveillance unit operating across rural zones prone to extremist resurgence and compromised infrastructure. The Granger Ranch was a node in a much larger system, one designed not just to observe but to act. But someone inside the system had flipped a mole. An entire counter-network had formed beneath the surface, hijacking towers, feeding false signals, recruiting local militias, and erasing operatives one by one. Grant had been the last unburned asset in Chestnut Ridge. Now he was presumed dead, or worse. Caroline was offered 2 options: enter federal protection, disappear forever, and never speak of this again, or walk away and live the rest of her life under constant surveillance, likely until someone decided she was no longer necessary. She chose silence. They relocated her to a quiet coastal town under a new name. She worked at a bookstore, kept her hair short, never used credit cards, never asked questions, and she never again tried to manage a neighborhood. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the pine trees outside her window, she thought about the ranch, the binder, and the man whose eyes saw too much and said too little. On those nights, she opened a locked wooden box in her closet, inside which was a small, faded photograph she'd managed to keep, a blurry image from a drone flight long ago. It showed a man standing in the middle of a ranch field, arms crossed, eyes aimed at the sky, watching, always watching, and she wondered, was he still out there, somewhere in the shadows, running a new operation, waiting for the next Karen to stumble across a secret she was never meant to find? Or had he become a ghost, like her, living in the silence between systems, forgotten by the world that spun on above them, clueless to the quiet wars fought in the spaces between barbed wire and barn doors? Whatever the answer, she knew one thing for certain: The HOA never had any real power. The clipboard never mattered. The lawns, the fences, the mailboxes, none of it. The real world operated behind fences no one could see, and she had touched that world once, and it had left a mark that no rule book could erase.